take roll.
Let's see. Town of Ashland, Miss Amos. And I know we have her had a message that she may have a bad connection, so I will mark her as present. Charles City County, Mr. Mitchell. Miss Russell.
Present.
Chesterfield County, Vice Chair Smith.
Here.
Miss Walker. Richland County, Mr. Goyne.
Here.
Mr. Coleman. Hanover County, Mr. Vadunez.
Here.
Mr. Flagg. Chesterfield County, Mr. Yor.
Henrico. Yeah.
Thank you. New Kent County, Mr. Stauder. Ms. LeDuc. Powhatan County, Mr. Chardine. City of Richmond, Chair Clark. DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky. Mr. Wagner.
Here.
PDOT, Mr. Totten. Mr. Riblett.
Here.
Ms. McAdory. Virginia Port Authority, Ms. Nelson. DRTC, Ms. Torres. Ms. Sink.
Here.
Thank you. RMTA, Ms. Dean. And Plan RVA, Mr. Parsons.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance. We do have a quorum, and Sid is working on getting the live stream started, so we can proceed.
Are you in a meeting now?
Okay, that sounds good. So Darona's not feeling well and asked if I would run the meeting, so that's why I'm talking. The first item on the agenda is consideration of amendments to the agenda. Are there any amendments? Okay, looks like we're good that way. So we'll move on to number 4, which is approval of the December 12th minutes. Is there a motion to approve the December 12th minutes?
I'll move for approval.
I'll second.
Thank you. We'll just do this by voice vote. All in favor, say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? All right, moving on to public comment period. I believe I need to read this. Yeah, Chet, is that correct? This meeting is being held via Zoom. A link to the Zoom webinar where individuals may register to participate is posted at the top of this agenda. Members of the public are invited to submit public comments either verbally or in writing. Written comments can be submitted through the Q&A or chat functions on Zoom or to the email address at the top of the agenda. Written comments will be read aloud or summarized during the meeting when possible and will be included in the meeting minutes. Verbal comments will be taken at this time. Please indicate through the Q&A chat functions on Zoom if you would like to comment. When acknowledged by the chairman, please clearly state your name so that it may be recorded in the meeting minutes. So let me check the Q&A. There are no questions there. Chat. I don't know where the chat is. Oh, there it is. And no comments in the chat either.
Mm-hmm.
No comments submitted in advance of the meeting?
No.
Okay. All right, so moving right along, CVTA TAC Chairs report. I've got nothing to report other than what I reported on already. So item number 7, CVTA regional allocation next steps. And I don't have a whole lot to say on this either. So the programming or spend plan is shown in the agenda item that got approved. So right now we're working still on getting a SPA standard project agreement in place so that we can get started on regional projects funded with the CVTA money. So that's still pending. Right now it's being reviewed by the city, Henrico and Chesterfield attorneys and will be distributed once we've gotten a first pass on that. So item number 8, project selection and allocation framework.
Madam
Jessa,
Chair,
yeah.
just real quick on item 7, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're also working now with Finance Committee as well as Chesterfield County and PFM to look at our short and long-term investments because that's going to come into play now that allocations are being assigned to certain years. So in addition to the SPAs, there's a couple projects you'll see in that spend plan table on page 6 that don't have schedules yet assigned. So we'd really like to get those nailed down sooner rather than later. It'll help us kind of clarify a lot of things. And obviously the biggest one there is I-64. So that may impact investment strategies when funds are going to need to be liquid and all those kinds of things. So we'll have updates on that hopefully over the next few meetings.
Okay. So in addition to 64, are there other projects you need schedules for?
Is Miles on? Miles, do you know offhand?
Yes, I think some of them are the fall line sections that we haven't figured out yet with the working group. So design build 3 is probably the biggest one that's sitting out there because I think it's about $25 million on that one. So I think those are the two biggest unknowns. Everything else, we have some version of the schedule in place.
Okay, so design build 3, we heard from VDOT at the last Fall Line Trail subcommittee meeting that design build 3 will be 9 months to advertisement after design build 2. And design build 2 has been pushed from summer of this year to fall of this year. So you can probably build it off of that information. Does that sound, can you work with that, Miles, or should we shoot you an email?
I think we can work with that. And I think we can work with VDOT too to refine that as we get, clearer dates to exactly what fiscal year things are going to fall into. But yeah, I think for penciling in for now, I think that should be fine.
Yeah.
Barb, this is Mark. I would agree with what you shared on the Fall Line Trail also, but then I would also ask on the 64 schedule. I know as Miles and you guys were working on the programming of those dollars, central office and Shane and those guys had shared some specific, requests in terms of when those fundings would be provided. And I think certainly the programming that you have has accomplished that. I'm just asking to find out what additional information you guys may need from us.
I guess this is Miles. I guess, Mark, what we would need to know is the exact split that you guys are going to need for those future years. It was kind of up to whatever the number was, 60 million in 25 and the rest in 26, whatever the numbers were. If you can give us the exact split of when those are needed, I think that's the biggest thing, because what we're trying to figure out right now is, short-term 6-month or year-long investments. So figuring out how far we can push out the 64 funding while still having it liquid when it's needed based on our future, standard project agreement.
Okay.
I had a question about Fall Line Trail for Mark. Will that be on reimbursement basis where you all will incur and spend or, pay for expenses on the project and then get reimbursed from the CVTA like on a monthly basis?
Barb, the quick answer to your question is I will need to double check on that. I think the terms of how that works out is specified in the SPA agreement that the CTB has with the CVTA, but I will double check that for you.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, anything else on CVTA regional allocations? All right, thank you. moving on to number 8, project selection and allocation framework. We've been, as you know, we've been working on the eligibility item in the parking lot. Chessa's got another commitment today, so wasn't able to join us, and she's the brains behind that eligibility item. So we have some other things that we can talk about, and I will remind you of those. And most of these are pretty light, you know, not overly complicated items that we can talk about. So in the eligibility under bridge, so we've been working on highway eligibility, but this is about bridge eligibility. When we set up the framework document, we indicated that the project has to be on the state of good repair bridge list, VDOT state of good repair bridge list, and meet the regional highway eligibility criteria to be eligible for CVTA regional. So when we were in the last round that we did, there are bridges listed on VDOT's state of good repair list that are designated as CUSP. Everything else is designated as poor. And so in our framework document, we're proposing that we clarify that to be eligible for CVTA regional, a bridge has to be on the state of good repair list as poor, in poor condition. The CUSP designation by VDOT means that it is still in the fair category and, you know, ready to tip over into poor, but it's not met. It's not in poor at this point. And so it's not eligible for VDOT state of good repair money. Is everyone following me? Okay, so if I can share my screen, perhaps. I don't know if I'm talented enough to do that. Let me see. Okay, I think I'm sharing it. So right here, what I'm proposing is that we just add to this bullet under bridge eligibility, bridge designated structurally deficient, poor condition, just to make it clear that the CUSP projects would not be eligible. Is there any discussion on that? Chet?
Should the rating agency be named?
Yeah. Well, it's here in the link, but yeah, that's probably a good idea to say bridge must be on VDOT's state of good repair eligibility list.
Yes, I guess I was thinking specifically about the structurally deficient poor. But yeah.
You could probably just say that bridge designated structurally deficient / poor condition by VDOT. Is that what you were looking at, Chad? Or
yes.
Is that, yeah.
Yeah.
And Barb, I think the change overall, I think makes sense. I think that was, you know, it might not have been a needed clarification, but I could see how that would be finagled to get funds for a bridge that maybe wasn't quite eligible.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That was a pretty easy one. Let me stop sharing. Whew. Okay. So is there general concurrence for that change? All right, we'll go ahead and make that revision. And
I have a question.
Sure.
What if a project it's CVTA funding would allow a project to go forward because there's a gap in funding and it doesn't satisfy one of those ratings? It could still be a desirable project for funding, but that language would exclude it. Am I reading that wrong?
Well, for bridge projects, we're saying that we're funding bridge projects that are in poor condition.
I understand that. That's not the question I asked, though.
I don't understand your question then.
So my question is, if this was a resource to meet a funding gap, there was other funding, more significant funding that supports a project, then those criteria, it has to be rated as poor, would automatically exclude it for a project that, in most cases, it's, I don't have a bridge project. So I'm just thinking, about the broader universe. If you had a project that needed a little bit of extra money in comparison to the total budget, and this is a funding resource, then it would exclude it. And so perhaps there needs to be a caveat that would allow it to be considered if it were to provide match funding. I'm sorry, not match funding, gap funding.
I'm trying to come up with a scenario. So let's say there was a bridge project.
Let me tell you what came to mind is the presentation that we just saw last week at the Plan RVA meeting. So that was they were talking about two bridges that when we were leaving, I recognized actually both of them. So I'm going to need Miles to step in on this, right? So weren't both of those projects over budget, Miles?
Are you talking about the Mayo Bridge, the presentation we had for the TPO?
Mm-hmm.
So does the Mayo Bridge is it structurally deficient and in poor condition?
I don't want us to focus on the project itself, because what I'm saying is that those criteria, if the bridge wasn't rated poor and it had, because of the length of implementation or cost overruns, if this is a resource that could fund that project, and in comparison to the total project budget, it's not a lot of money, that criteria would automatically exclude it.
Yeah, and that is true. So I guess what I was trying to do is create a scenario that I can relate to. So let's say there's a project the county's initiated to do a bridge replacement using revenue sharing money in their county, and the bridge really is not structurally deficient, but the project involves adding sidewalk, and there's a gap. Then it could compete if it met the highway eligibility or the bike ped eligibility part of CVTA regional to get some funding made up. But for the bridge category, it's for bridges on regionally significant roads or regionally eligible roads for bridges that are in poor condition. So it's got to meet the highway eligibility and be in poor condition.
I'm just raising the question. So if the conversation is just between you and I'm willing to move forward, but I just wanted to make sure that's what we intended. That,
let me, maybe I guess how I understand the bridge category is it's not a capacity addition. It's not an improvement. It's just a rehabilitation. I think that was the intent of the bridge category in and of itself. Is that accurate, Barb?
That is true. So if it were a bridge widening, or if it was,
yeah, that's got to go elsewhere.
Then it's in the highway category.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can talk about it, Rhonda.
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right, let's see what else I've got. Sorry. So another item in our parking lot that we're working on has to do with estimates and validation. And this is part of the discussion outside of just the CVTA with the TPO about estimates. You all probably saw Miles' really great summary of the status of CMAQ and RSTP projects and how those projects have been performing as far as estimates go. I couldn't quite remember where it left off, if it's moved over to TAC for review or if it's still kind of on hold. Miles, is it going to be coming up at the next TAC meeting?
It's coming up TAC, and then we're doing some additional what they called summer school for some of the elected officials so they can learn more about cost estimating.
Yeah.
But and yeah, it's next up for TAC.
So, and I know this is a different TAC, and I had an email, Madam Chair, I had an email into Chet asking if that's on our agenda for tomorrow for TPO TAC, or how we plan to add that to the agenda tomorrow. But we can talk offline, but I need some clarification as well, where we want to fit that in for discussion with members.
Right. Okay. So I see that discussion with the TPO TAC informing our discussion here at CVTA in the framework document. So that discussion is ongoing, starting with TPO TAC.
And I think we could talk a little bit today. I mean, Miles has put together a couple slides to at least frame the lens that CVTA should be considering, because not all of the cost estimating issues are relevant to CVTA, but there's a couple things that really do hit home in terms of differences and methods.
Okay. Miles, before you go, Austin?
Yeah, I guess the intent of, excuse me, the cost estimating, do we want both organizations to follow the exact same process? I know, Chet, you just mentioned that there might be some things that don't apply here that might apply to the TPO, but and just throwing something out there, if the TPO says we want to go with VDOT Smart Scale estimating tool as the tool, do we then adopt that exact same process here? I'm just trying to figure out what the intent of that is.
Yeah, I can see that there would be differences perhaps. But I think we got to start the discussion and try to make sure that we're keeping our organization straight. So Miles, can you go through your summary?
Sure, I've got the abbreviated version of what we did at the policy board. All right, so this was sort of originally developed for the policy board, and then it shifted to the presentation that you all saw last week. But as everybody here already knows, cost estimating is really a most likely estimate. So it's not an end-all be-all number. This is it's a range. You know, it can go up, can go down. This is the best guess on where it's going to be based on what information is known at the time. If you're all familiar with the AASHTO, different estimate classes, but essentially most of the projects that we're picking are in this class 4 and 5 when we're going in through CVTA or the TPO, which really means there's a huge range in terms of, sort of expected behavior of the cost going below or the cost going above what the estimate is. So what the TPO is trying to do right now is figure out how to narrow that range, essentially. Is a lot of the conversation that's going on. I guess the other piece, and this is kind of going to Austin's question, is VDOT's new approach with cost estimating and the cost estimating manual is to try and standardize everything statewide. So everything that's going into the 6-year program is following the same estimating process, using the same language around estimates. But essentially there's 4 components: your defined costs, your known knowns, and things that you can quantify and you're going to need. The allowances, the known unknowns, so you're going to need it, but you don't know how much. Contingency, which is a project-specific risk on different elements, and then inflation or escalation over time. And this is kind of what it looks like. This came straight out of the cost estimating manual, but essentially as you go through the life of the project, you know more information, estimates get better. So this is kind of just the background of what we're going into. The CVTA's current approach is largely based on what the TPO has done historically. So we require the quarterly reporting, and that's obviously something that has to get in place when we have actual projects moving forward. And then basically if the project increase is 10% above the initial award, then or below, the TAC can make the final decision. If it's beyond that, it requires the full authority to act, which is the same setup that we have with the TPO with TAC and the policy board. And then the options are balance entry, reducing scope, funding swaps if there's another project that schedule wouldn't be impacted, requiring the sponsor to use other funds, or deselecting the project completely. And the other piece of it is we have a reserve policy to try and accommodate these requests because, you know, based on the curve, we know that there's going to be increases on a lot of projects over time. That's just part of the expectation since we're selecting projects with a little information. So the reserve policy can help to accommodate some of that. So the top table here is kind of what's the target, the reserve that we've adopted. So it ramps up 10% in year 1, up to 35% in year 6, 5% additional every year. So this is what we're getting to. The actual was based on decisions that were made when we did a 4-year program to reduce the reserves with the understanding that most of these projects were only going to be going into PE. So there's not a lot of risk of them going over and needing additional money right up front. So this is kind of where we're at now. With the latest allocation plan, we did try and make year 5 and year 6 line up with the target policy, and we actually wound up with a little bit of extra. So we do have reserves in the later out years, but early on, we don't have the reserves that our target policy would expect us to have, which just means if there are cost increases, we're going to have to generally look for funding farther out. The big thing as staff reviewed the CVTA projects is things that are VDOT administered. We really need to get VDOT involved sooner in the process. So when we had the VDOT administered projects, most of them are underfunded to be able to actually move forward. The same thing applied when we looked at the smart scale projects. Once they went through the smart scale process, the estimates came in higher. So if we were trying to leverage, say, PE and right away, we didn't actually have enough for PE and right away as it went through that smart scale process in a lot of cases. So getting VDOT involved as the estimate validator, if they're going to be the ones either administering the project or if it's expected to go through smart scale or some other VDOT program, would probably be beneficial. So we make sure we're funding at the right level for those projects. So I think this could be incorporated as part of the third-party review. But this is one thing that was pretty clear from the CVTA project list. From the TPO's active projects, for anyone who sat through the whole presentation last week, on the whole, we're about 20%, 26% is the median project, is over the original cost estimate. So it's not terrible, it's within the expected range, but it is an increase above that estimate. So from the board, there was some level of direction that we want to find out how to bring that down. So that's why it's coming back to the TPO TAC. The big thing we did see was there were several projects, mostly older, that were well above that and raised the mean. So the median looked pretty good. The mean was about 198% above so it was a much worse. And really what we see is there's 3 big things that were causing those changes: long delays or periods of inactivity where inflation and then eventually scope changes impacted the projects. Rescoping and changing requirements. The Mayo Bridge that was mentioned, just as an example, went from a deck project to a complete, deck rehab to a complete reconstruction of the superstructure. So it's the change in scope obviously drove much of the cost increase there. And then the other big thing that we noticed was changing project administration. So if a project was locality administered and then went to VDOT administration, there were cost increases or cost changes associated because they each have to administer it based on their own guidelines. It just changes what the project looks like. So those were the 3 biggest things that we observed looking at the TPO program. And obviously the biggest thing that was impacting the TPO's funding was how much of the funding was coming from the TPO. So if the TPO has only got a small share of the project, it didn't matter if the cost went up over time because it didn't impact our piece of that project. But if we were funding an entire project, it had a lot of impact. And then this is, again, the TPO side, but these were some of the options that the board was given that they're sending to the TAC to review as potentials for improving the outcomes and reducing the impact of cost increases on the funding program. So, and this is kind of going back to Austin's point. So one option was using more conservative assumptions, like using the smart scale approach and assuming VDOT assumptions across the board, requiring that risk-based contingencies, which is the estimating manual approach. The second thing we looked at was increasing project definition. So basically on the curve, moving on the x-axis, getting more information, reducing the range of cost overruns that are possible. Reducing the program exposure. So this is kind of what I was saying in the last point, but if we're only funding a portion of the project, whether it's a fixed dollar amount or only one or two phases of the project, the whole project cost doesn't have as much of an impact. So if construction gets more expensive, it doesn't impact us if we're only paying for PE. And then the last thing was improving time to delivery, something along the lines of awarding funds contingent on specific schedules. This is kind of built into the way RSTP and federal funds in general work because there are deadlines for obligating funds. But a lot of what we do is reshuffle the money and keep the project moving. And that's lets those projects linger out longer. And in some cases, the funding hasn't been shuffled and it's just sitting there. So that's another option that the board has sent over to the TAC for consideration. Obviously, more items will come out of the discussion, but these were some ideas that staff identified just from our review of the project list. So that's kind of the nutshell of everything that we've been looking at. And I'm happy to answer any questions or change the slides as needed.
Does anyone have any questions for Miles?
I do. This is Sharon. A copy of the presentation would be good. I know we had talked about that at TPO. Just so we could digest it a little bit more, please. And I need to talk offline with Chet about how we're including this in the TPO TAC agenda tomorrow morning.
So the TPO agenda from last week, if you go to that item, the full presentation that was presented last week is posted there, which includes these options, some of the trade-offs that staff identified with these options, as well as the overviews of all the projects that we looked at.
Okay, thanks, Miles. I didn't realize that had been updated since the meeting. Thank you.
One thing I think we have to our advantage with CVTA is that we can do PE only projects and studies. So item number 2 gives us an opportunity to get 10%, 30% or bigger even design to inform another request for CVTA regional for the full project to get to right of way and construction. And that's always been a challenge with the VDOT funding programs is, they would like to have a lot of information to really reduce the risk and, to dial in on some of the assumptions, but it's really hard to get the funding, state or federal funding for PE only projects. Well, and federal is changing. A lot of the federal grants are planning grants where you can go after federal grant money to get going on a project and then seek funding subsequently for the delivery of the project. So something to keep in mind there too. That's a good example of what Austin was pointing at, that, what we decide with the TPO might not be the same as what we decide here at CVTA. Over on the TPO, I think it would be very challenging to require localities to have a 10%, even just a 10% design on projects they're submitting for CMAQ or RSTP. So anyone else have comments on estimates?
I was going to say the same thing about number 2, is that I feel like that's really challenging, especially because I could see the scenario where a locality such as Goochland is going to end up using the vast majority of our CVTA local funds to potentially get a project at 10 or 30% for the TPO applications or for other applications. So that's something that I think provides a little bit of a cause for concern. I think I had brought up when we first started revisiting the guidelines about getting VDOT, if they're going to administer the project, which they will likely in the near term administer all of our projects, unless it's something really, really small. So from our standpoint, I think it would make sense for VDOT to just go ahead and provide that estimate. But I think there is a lot of risk involved because we've just seen some of ours explode. So it's, yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but it's something that we definitely need to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Austin. Sharon?
So, Madam Vice Chair, I was just thinking about, what you and Austin were talking about with the, more upfront engineering. And I know we're always learning, and but I was thinking of, sometimes Enrico had some STAR studies where VDOT had reviewed the cost estimates, and those were submitted, and those were some of the projects that skyrocketed when they were reviewed again. So I think if we pick something, whether it's the estimating manual or the smart scale approach, or just to make sure it's being reviewed the same, with the estimating, I think we all want to try, we all are trying to do our best. But anyway, just the STAR studies, I think when those estimates are being reviewed, and I think there's been some changes since then to help improve the process and the estimates.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of the early STAR studies, definitely planning level estimates, and the approach in smart scale is a lot different, where they're just trying to make sure that they've got all the funding in place and don't need to go back to the CTB for that money. And I've gotten the impression that they are trying to dial in a little bit more on the smart scale studies. Mark?
I think so too, yeah.
Barb, I'll just confirm that our current ongoing STARS studies are looking to have deliverables that end up with a smart scale ready application estimate, so that we don't have those disconnects between what comes out of a STARS study versus what's going into a smart scale process. So Liz and our planning folks are doing a good job at looking to work in deliverables into those framework documents for the new STAR studies to ensure that we do have some consistency between those two processes.
That sounds great. Okay.
Thank you. I thought that was the case. Thank you for confirming, Mark.
Yep, absolutely.
Anybody else have comments on estimates in relation to CVTA?
Barb, this is Dirona.
Oh, Dorona, you should be taking a nap.
No, I'm listening. Just quickly, I'm a little slow. So, my team was a little bit, taken back with just some of the presentation, in that we happen to be, one of the localities that won, the TPO was the majority funder, and we took the longest. And it definitely had some scope changes. But to that, I think that the CVTA is a different funding source with greater capacity. And while I think what transpired over time for RSTP funding, may and can be different for CVTA. So I do think that we need to just, be clear and try to come up with a good way to organize the CVTA's process, so that, we do take a lot of things in consideration before assuming, every project's, basis of success is cost and estimate. So, so without being too stringent, I do think that there's some conversation that we could have around it to make sure that we choose the right thing for CVTA. And then lastly, on just a question on the average contribution, I know that was used That's going to be talked about tomorrow with our TPO and some of the requests for the funding. So we also want to take, and I think that's a part of this conversation as well, when something it has the 10% over, it goes to the board, but really looking at some of those scenarios more specifically, because when we talk about the reserves is what funds these cost overruns, I just know for the last few years, new funding allocations or appropriations from the federal government also have funded cost overruns. And so, or at least have not funded new project applications. I'll say that. So, just to be clear that we look at all of our resources and look at all of how we've been doing things so that we really can come up with a fair process that doesn't allow for someone to have to wait many years before a new project can be entered. But even if that's the case, then are we, getting the projects paid for that are on the books? So I'll save more of that for tomorrow. But again, thanks, Miles, for getting this in front of us. As it went to our policy board members first and created some flames. But I look forward to working through this for CVTA.
Thanks, Jerona. Your comments do kind of lend themselves to the thought that, perhaps projects of certain estimates or greater be required to go through PE only, get PE only funding first. I'm just throwing that out for people to chew on a little bit and think about. But if you have a big project, maybe the requirement is to first get PE only money before it competes to get the entire project funded with CVTA Regional.
Yeah, and I think that's somewhat of a good something to lower the risk for CVTA as well.
Mm-hmm. Austin?
Yeah, the only downside to that is if VDOT administers the project, they won't do any PE design on it without it being completely fully funded to the final estimate. So for, like our big interchange project that's 80+ million through Smart Scale, even if we had the PE funds on it through CVTA and we couldn't do anything with it because VDOT was going to administer the PE.
Well, that's for their program. So with their funding sources, they do require that all phases be funded or identified in the 6-year plan. But in our program, we can hire them through our project agreement to do just a PE only project. The risk to the CVTA is that we could spend money on these PE only projects and then not have them come to fruition and not get built. And that's something that VDOT and the feds definitely want to avoid. And I think that's part of the problem with getting money just for PE is they don't want to spend money on something that isn't going to be a benefit to the public down the road, a guaranteed project.
And what they told us was kind of counter to what you just said, that even if it's through CVTA, that they wouldn't administer our interchange projects, even though it's not, state funds or anything, that they essentially weren't going to touch it under any circumstances until it was completely fully funded. We tried that approach to kind of nail down the estimate a little bit, essentially kind of run through what we're talking about is to bring down, or at least, lower the risk. And they wouldn't go through that process until it was fully funded. And I completely understand why, because of the things you just pointed out. We don't want to go through the PE and then all of a sudden waste however much money, $2 million on some design and right away and utilities without the project moving forward.
But it was CVTA money that was going to fund the PE, right?
Correct.
So Mark, can you comment on that?
And so one of the exercises that we were going through initially was how we start and initiate a project that at that time had a much lower value of dollars associated with it. And Austin, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we were talking in the $2 million range at the time.
Yeah, the PE was 2.1, 2.4, somewhere in there.
Right, and I think our current estimates for PE on the full project certainly exceed that right now. So we weren't even getting to a point where we had the ability to start a PE phase on that entire project that was going to come with other funding. an option that we might want to think about, whether it's, for any project moving forward, is the idea of potentially going down a path where we're doing a steady only or a PE only project that really start to finish 100% is CVTA funded. Then the risk to us is not the same as what you'd identified. So there may be a way to thread that needle to do exactly what, Barb, you were proposing, to then meet, Austin, the needs that you were talking about. At the time we were talking about the interchange project, it was, we want to start the entire project, and we didn't have an ability to do that, or even the whole PE phase, because at that point the entire PE phase wasn't funded. If we have an approach where the expectation is actually to do something different, let's do some work, some steady efforts to try and better define the project. There's a way to identify and again thread that needle.
Okay, that sounds good. Any other comments on estimates? Okay, this is one of our parking lot items for the framework document that will keep our ongoing discussion. Moving on to project selection. One item that I had in the parking lot was for studies and PE only projects. The guidelines or the framework document says the funding set aside for those should not exceed 5% and 10% respectively. And I was wondering if Chet and Miles might be able to tell us how much we did program last round, percentage-wise, towards studies and PE only. And you might not have that handy, but maybe for next meeting.
I have it handy. I saw it on your notes. So it's 5% for the PE only projects is what we actually awarded. So when we did the original spreadsheet with the project prioritization, we put those calculations in. So we had a ceiling and a floor in there for each of them. So it was basically the percentage of the requests and then what was the cap at the 10%. So we tried to stick within that. I think this round would have been a special round either way because the intent was to fund the whole slate of projects. So I think that would have justified going around that if we had to, but it wound up that 2 of those projects went in as full projects as opposed to PE only.
Yeah, and we did leave the wording kind of smushy in the framework document, should instead of shall, so that we had flexibility. We didn't want to get to a point where we were at 12% and couldn't fund whatever was making us go over. Yeah. All right, so that's good to hear. The last item I have is pretty specific to Chesterfield. So does anyone have any other comments on studies and PE only? And the percentage caps? I'll move on to this Chesterfield specific issue. So in the last round, Chesterfield submitted an application for 360 widening, and we submitted it as a PE only for $2 million. And we also submitted it for leveraging and smart scale, asking for 20 million in CVTA regional. So it got selected for the leveraging. So my question to the group is, if it were not successful in smart scale in getting funded, which we should be hearing about smart scale in mid-January, could the project move forward using 2 million for PE only, since it was submitted as a PE only, and reduce the leveraging from 20 to 18? So anyway, I feel like I should probably send that as a formal request so people can think about it.
Yeah, Madam
Sharon.
Madam Chair, it's a good question. I think Henrico has a few examples of that as well, where we were leveraging funds for smart scale for PE.
So maybe that's something to have on our agenda for our next meeting. If we could put together a list, Miles, of projects that were submitted for both PE only and for smart scale leveraging, and we can decide if those projects should move forward with the PE only while they're waiting to go through another leveraging request with Smart Scale. So leveraging was another parking lot item that was brought to our attention by the full authority. They are concerned about the way the framework document is written currently that says that once you get leveraging funds in place, you can go through 2 rounds of Smart Scale and try to get the project fully funded before the leveraging dollars go away. I think the full authority is concerned about holding those funds and not utilizing the funds through 2 rounds of Smart Scale, which is 4 years in essence. And I think that once we do see the Smart Scale results in mid-January, we'll have a better idea of, or it might provide us with some information that can help us in this discussion. One thing that concerns me though is that every round of Smart Scale is different. You've heard people say that all the time, that it depends on the projects you're competing against each round. So where a project might look bad in this round of Smart Scale, the next round it might be better. And without seeing the results, it's kind of hard to come to any conclusions at this point. But I think we will need to analyze the results of the Smart Scale round and provide a report back to the full authority about the success of our leveraging projects, and perhaps make recommendations if we think that there's a project that is probably going to not be successful in the next round. Mark?
Just a quick observation, Barb, you are 100% correct that while we are expecting that at the CTB meeting in mid-January, we'll have the scorecards and the recommended funding scenario. Even if a project scores poorly or maybe not good enough to be included in the original staff recommended funding scenario, that doesn't mean it's not going to get selected for round 5. So there could be an evaluation of how they did in Smart Scale round 5 based on what's presented to the CTB in January, but that could be very different than what is finally approved in the May-June timeframe.
Yeah, that's true too. I hadn't thought about that.
But that evaluation could help leverage some of those kind of lobbying discussions for those projects that maybe weren't included originally on the funding scenario. So it's probably good to look at, but what's shown in January is not necessarily the final answer, for sure.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Yep.
Austin?
Yeah, one thought is, let's say whoever's got a killer project on CVTA and it scores #1 as far as that scoring criteria, but for whatever reason, it can't get Smart Scale funds. There's competition or just a crazy cost. It's a $150 million project. Let's just say it doesn't get funds. Does that rollback of the leverage funds through CVTA preclude you from applying the next cycle through CVTA? Is that language currently in there that if you don't score Smart Scale twice, you can't ever apply again?
Oh. No, it doesn't mean you can't ever apply again.
Okay.
It's just you got to recompete for your leveraging. And the intent was when you're asking for the money the second time, you might be thinking of a different scope.
Right.
Or you might be asking for a different amount of funds. There might be some sort of thought into how can I make it work better in Smart Scale the next time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we share your thoughts as far as being, Smart Scale is a little bit different every time, and the competition is, there's a statewide project that's super important, and it sucks up a lot of the money. So of course, you're not going to get funded, but then next time you might automatically get funded because you're going to move to the top of, to the front of the line. So yeah, that's something that you need to carefully consider, the 2 versus 1 cycle.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other comments on leveraging? Well, I appreciate everyone attending today. Let me just make sure how we're doing on our agenda. Are there any, so I think we're finished with project selection and allocation framework for today. So item number 9 on the agenda is CVTA TAC member comments. Does anyone have any comments for the group?
I have 2 quick ones.
Sure.
Are we, and I don't know, now that we're coming out of the age of COVID, I think finally, are we ever going to go in person? Is that the intent for this? I'm just questioning the group. I don't know if that's been given any thought. And then number 2, the CTB hearing, is it going to be at the 17th or the 19th meeting? Which day that week? Because there's 2.
So I'll let Mark answer the CTB question.
Our expectation is that it's going to be on the workshop agenda for the CTB, so it would be at the first of the 2.
The 17th. Okay.
This is not an action item. So
okay.
Only action items are generally at the second half of the meeting.
All right, just making sure.
Yep.
And then as far as in person or virtually, Chet, do you want to talk about that or?
Sure. I mean, we've discussed this off and on a couple times, and the preference for most of TAC was to stay virtual as long as possible for convenience.
That's fine.
But the whole thing hinges right now on the emergency declaration that the city still has in place. I was made aware yesterday that there's a couple bills at General Assembly right now to expand the freedom of holding virtual meetings for regional bodies. So
okay.
We got to watch that. But I mean, I think at any point we're now in the new space in Manchester. So we do have conference room and all that stuff is available anytime. So staff is flexible. Just depends on what TAC wants to do.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I do like virtual for convenience, and it saves a lot of time not having to commute. And I'm sure it's a lot easier for folks that are farther away from the new Plan RVA building. But I do kind of miss seeing people in person and the networking that just kind of naturally happens at the end of a meeting. So maybe we would think about twice a year or once a quarter, something, having an in-person meeting so we can see each other. But we'll kick the can down the road for a little bit on that. All right. Our next meeting is February 13th. The intent is to get the eligibility test project information out to folks in advance of that meeting so that we can wrap up the discussion of that framework item, the parking lot item related to highway eligibility. So we can get that done and knocked out. That's really been the biggest work effort we've got. And so hopefully we'll have some good discussion at the February 13th meeting on that. Otherwise, that's it. So I'll call for adjournment, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barb.
I hope you feel better, Dorona.
Thank you.